The first bullet shattered a champagne glass before anyone screamed. Ava Carter didn't flinch. She stood in the center of the Aurelius Grand Ballroom, black waitress apron still tied at her waist. 4 armed men fanned out in a loose semicircle around her, and somewhere behind them, propped against an overturned table, a journalist named Ethan Brooks pressed a hand to a bleeding shoulder and stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "Get down," one of the gunmen barked, waving his pistol at her face. "Get on your knees." Ava looked past him, at the exits, at the second gunman drifting left, at the third who kept glancing at his phone instead of watching her hands. Rookies. Park Min-seok had sent rookies. "Last chance," the man said. She smiled. It wasn't the smile of a woman who worked doubles for $11 an hour and never made trouble. It was the smile of someone who had done this before, in worse rooms, against worse men, for reasons no one in this ballroom would ever know. "No," she said quietly, "it's yours." 3 days earlier, nobody in that hotel would have believed this woman capable of throwing a punch, let alone disarming 4 men in under a minute. 3 days earlier, she was just Ava, quiet, careful, the waitress who never complained. The Aurelius Grand sat on the edge of the city, like a monument to money that didn't want to explain itself. Marble floors, gold trim, a doorman who could tell a real Rolex from a fake one at 15 feet. It was, officially, a 5-star hotel. Unofficially, it was the crown jewel of Park Min-seok's empire, a place where his cash got clean and his enemies got quiet. Ava had worked there for 8 months. She arrived before dawn, left after midnight, and sent most of her paycheck to her sister Grace, who was 2 years into medical school and surviving on ramen and ambition. Ava herself lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with a mattress on the floor, a locked steel box under the bed, and nothing on the walls except a single photograph she never let anyone see. "You're doing it again," said Daniel Harris, the floor manager, watching her refold napkins that were already folded, standing by the east exit like you're guarding it. "Old habit," Ava said. "You have a lot of old habits." Daniel wasn't wrong to be curious. In 8 months, Ava had never called in sick, never raised her voice, never once reacted when Park's men made her life difficult, and they made everyone's life difficult. "You okay? Lieutenant Cho was pretty ugly with you yesterday." "I'm fine, Daniel." She wasn't offended by the memory. Cho had shoved past her with a tray of drinks, dumped 2 of them down her uniform by accident, then laughed with his friends while she apologized for being in his way. Her co-workers had watched, humiliated on her behalf, and said nothing, because saying something to one of Park's men could get you fired. Or worse. Ava had wiped the wine from her sleeve, said, "Of course, sir, I'm sorry," and gone right on working. What none of them saw was what happened at 4:30 the next morning, in the small gym 2 blocks from her apartment, the one that opened before sunrise for people who worked nights and needed somewhere to go. Ava moved through a routine that looked less like exercise and more like a language. Strikes, holds, footwork drilled so many thousand times it had stopped being conscious. A thin white scar ran along her collarbone. Another, older, traced her forearm. She never talked about them. At home, under her bed, the steel box held a folded uniform, 3 medals she never wore, and a single photo of 6 soldiers in a country she wasn't allowed to name, 4 of whom weren't alive anymore. She was 30 years old and had already lived an entire life that ended the day she signed papers, promising never to speak of it. Since then, she'd built herself a small, quiet, invisible one instead. "Grace called while you were on break," Daniel said, handing her a note. "Said it's important." Ava dialed from the stairwell, one of the only places in the hotel with real privacy. "Hey, Gracie." "Ava, I passed my boards. First try. Grace's voice cracked with disbelief and joy. I actually passed. Of course you passed. Ava closed her eyes and let herself feel it. Pure, uncomplicated pride, the kind she rarely allowed herself anymore. I never doubted you for a second. I couldn't have done any of this without you. The tuition, Ava, I know what you're sacrificing to keep me in school. I see how tired you are. I'm not tired, Ava lied gently. I'm proud. That's different. When are you going to tell me what you actually did over there? Before the diner? Before all of this? Gracie, I'm not asking you to relive it. I'm asking you to stop carrying it alone. Ava looked down the stairwell, at the fire door, at the little red exit sign, the way she looked at every room she entered, cataloguing, assessing, out of habit, out of a life she couldn't fully leave behind. One day, she said, I promise, not today. Okay. Grace's voice softened. I love you. Be careful at that place. I don't like how you talk about your boss. I can handle Daniel. Not Daniel. The other one. Park. Ava didn't answer right away. I can handle him too, she finally said, and meant something by it that her sister couldn't understand yet. She was still holding the phone when the elevator chimed and Park Min-seok walked into the lobby, and every single person in the building changed the way they moved. Park was not a large man, but he didn't need to be. Power had a way of making its own gravity, and his bent the whole room toward him. The concierge straightened, the bartender stopped mid-pour, 2 security guards fell into step 3 paces behind him like satellites. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, and an expression that suggested boredom was his natural resting state, right up until something amused him. Ava amused him. He noticed her first because Lieutenant Cho pointed her out, laughing about the wine incident, and Park's eyes settled on the quiet waitress refilling water glasses at a corner table with perfect, unhurried economy of motion. Most people got nervous around him. She didn't. That, more than anything, was what caught his attention. You, he said, the one Cho embarrassed yesterday. Yes, sir. Ava kept her eyes respectfully lowered, her voice even. You're not angry with him? It was an accident, sir. Park studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies something he can't quite categorize. Everyone is angry with somebody in this building. Everyone is afraid of somebody. Which are you? Neither, sir. I'm just working. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not respect, not yet, but the beginning of irritation. Park Min-seok had built an empire on the currency of fear, and fear required a reaction. Ava gave him none. To a man like Park, that wasn't calm. That was defiance wearing a waitress's apron. Bring me a table by the window, he said. You, personally. Of course, sir. She led him across the room, seated him, poured his water without a tremor in her hand, and when he deliberately knocked his glass onto the floor and said nothing, only watched her, she knelt without a word and cleaned it up. Interesting, Park murmured to Cho once she'd walked away. Find out everything about her. She's nobody, boss, just a waitress. Nobody stays this calm around me by accident. Park's smile didn't reach his eyes. I want to know why. That night, 3 floors above the ballroom, in a hotel suite with the curtains drawn, a man named Ethan Brooks sat hunched over a laptop with a portable hard drive full of financial records he'd spent 4 months assembling. Shell companies, laundered accounts, 3 unsolved disappearances that traced back to Aurelius Holdings. He was 32, sharp, stubborn, and utterly convinced he was being careful. He was not being careful enough. 2 floors below him, in a service corridor, a man in a housekeeping uniform who had never once cleaned a room reported to Cho that the journalist in 1407 had been photographing financial documents through a long lens for the past 3 nights. He knows, Cho told Park the next morning, or he's close enough that it doesn't matter. Park set down his coffee without spilling a drop. Then we stopped being subtle. For the next 4 days, Park made Ava's life exactly as miserable as he'd promised himself he would. He had her reassigned to double shifts. He had Cho accidentally bump into her twice more. He made a point of summoning her personally, asking for things designed to be difficult. A specific wine from the cellar 3 floors down, an out-of-season fruit, a folded napkin redone 6 times because the first 5 weren't precise enough. Ava did all of it without complaint, and every act of quiet obedience seemed to irritate Parks, more than open defiance would have. "Why don't you fight back?" he asked her on the 4th night, cornering her near the service elevator with 2 of his men flanking him. "Everyone breaks eventually. Cry, quit, beg, something." "I need this job, sir," Ava said. "I have a sister in medical school." Touching. Park stepped closer, close enough that his men tensed, close enough that any normal person would have backed away. Ava didn't move. "You know what I think? I think you're not calm. I think you're just very good at hiding what you actually are." For 1/2 second, something in Ava's eyes went very still and very cold, a door cracking open on a room she kept permanently locked. Park saw it. It vanished before he could name it, but he saw it, and something in his chest, some old animal instinct that had kept him alive through 3 assassination attempts, told him he had just looked at something dangerous. He laughed it off, told himself he was imagining things. He was wrong. That same night, Ava noticed the housekeeping cart parked outside, room 1407, for the 3rd evening running, staffed by a man who never once knocked on a door or changed a single sheet. She noticed the 2 extra guards who'd appeared on the 14th floor. She noticed the way conversations went quiet whenever Ethan Brooks walked through the lobby. She found him at the hotel bar the next evening, nursing a whiskey he clearly wasn't tasting, jotting something in a notebook he thought was subtle. "You should leave the hotel tonight," she said quietly, setting down a water glass he hadn't ordered. "Now, if you can." Ethan looked up, startled. "Excuse me?" "They know what you're doing. The man watching room 1407 isn't housekeeping. There are 2 extra men on your floor who weren't there 3 days ago." Ava kept her voice low, her expression unreadable, refilling glasses at the next table as if nothing were happening. "Leave through the service exit on the west side, not the lobby, not your car. It's being watched." Ethan's journalist instincts, trained to distrust everyone, kicked in immediately. "Who are you? Why would a waitress know any of that?" "Someone trying to help you." "I don't need help from—" He stopped himself, embarrassed, then softened. "Look, I appreciate the concern, but I've been doing this a long time. I know how to handle myself." Ava looked at him for a long moment, a look that carried more history than he could possibly guess, and said only, "I hope you're right." She was wrong to hope. He wasn't. 2 nights later, Ethan Brooks made the mistake of meeting a source in the hotel's private garden at 11 o'clock, believing the darkness would protect him. It didn't. Park's men were waiting before he arrived. The confrontation spilled from the garden into the ballroom, where a private event was winding down, and 40 guests in cocktail dresses and tailored suits suddenly found themselves staring down the barrels of 4 handguns. "Everybody down," one gunman screamed, and the room dissolved into chaos. Screaming, scattering, a woman's champagne glass shattering as she dropped it and ran. Ethan backed against an overturned table, blood already soaking through his shoulder from where a guard had pistol-whipped him in the garden, staring at the 4 men closing in like he'd finally understood, far too late, exactly what he'd been playing with. Daniel Harris froze completely, hands raised, eyes wide with the particular helplessness of a man who has never had to be brave before and is discovering he doesn't know how. Security, such as it was, had already fled, because security at the Aurelius Grand worked for Park, and Park had ordered them to stand down. That left one person standing calmly in the center of the ballroom while everyone else hit the floor. "You too!" the lead gunman snapped at Ava, gun swinging toward her. "On your knees." And this exact moment, gun raised, glass shattering, a wounded journalist bleeding against an overturned table, is where the story actually began. CTA, Call to Action. If you're feeling that hook already, that's exactly what this story is built to do. Hit subscribe now so the rest of Ava's fight doesn't slip past you, and drop a comment telling us where you think this is headed. Now, back to the ballroom. Ava did not kneel. She looked at the gunman, at his stance, at the 2-second gap between his last blink and his next one, and something inside her, something that had been folded up and put away for 3 years, quietly unfolded. "Last chance," he said. "No," she said. "It's yours." He fired a half-second too late. Ava was already moving, inside his guard before the shot finished echoing, wrist locked and twisted until the gun clattered free, his own momentum used to put him on the floor, with his arm bent at an angle that made him scream. The second man swung his weapon toward her. She was already past it, an elbow to the throat, the gun stripped from his hand and skittering across marble before he understood what had happened. The third hesitated, just long enough. A sweep of the legs, a strike to the base of the skull, and he folded. The fourth ran. She let him. 11 seconds. 4 armed men. Not a single shot fired after the first one, not a single innocent touched, and Ava Carter stood in the center of the Aurelius Grand ballroom, breathing evenly. 3 unconscious men at her feet, 40 stunned guests staring at her like she'd stepped out of another world. Because she had. On the ground, she told Ethan, kneeling beside him, checking his shoulder with hands that had done this before, in worse places, on worse wounds. "You're going to be fine. Stay still." "Who?" Ethan stared at her, pale from blood loss and disbelief. "Who are you?" "Someone who told you to use the service exit," she said, and for the first time there was the faintest, exhausted smile. Across the room, half hidden by an overturned table, Park Min-seok watched the entire thing without moving, his coffee-colored eyes wide for the first time in longer than he could remember. His Yanjin empire ran on the certainty that fear controlled people, that violence settled every argument, that nothing in this hotel could surprise him. He had just watched a waitress dismantle 4 of his men with her bare hands in 11 seconds, and he understood, with the sick clarity of a man realizing he'd made an unrecoverable mistake, that he had been humiliating the wrong person for a week. "Find out who she is," he said to the one lieutenant still standing, his voice tight. "Tonight. I don't care what it costs." It cost him more than he expected. By morning, the security footage had leaked. First inside Park's own organization, then to a private intelligence contact he kept on retainer, then, inevitably, to someone with the right access and the right price. What came back wasn't a name and an address. It was a classified file with most of its lines redacted in black, stamped with clearances Park had never seen attached to a hotel employee before. Ava Carter, United States Army, Special Operations, multiple commendations, most of them still sealed, extensive training in close quarters combat, hostage rescue, and intelligence gathering. Presumed retired following classified operations overseas. The file ended there, the rest blacked out by a government that didn't explain itself to Korean crime syndicates. Park read it twice, sitting alone in his office long after his men had gone home, and felt something he hadn't felt in over a decade, the cold understanding that he was not, in fact, the most dangerous person in the building. "She's a soldier," Cho said quietly, standing across the desk, his arm in a sling. "A real one. Not security, not private contractor, special operations." "I know what it says." Park closed the file. "Kill her, before she becomes a bigger problem than she already is." "Boss, if the American government finds out I don't care." Park's voice cracked just slightly, the first sign of fear his men had heard from him in years. "She humiliated me in my own hotel. I want her gone before she brings the rest of them down on us." 300 miles away, in a federal building with better security than the Aurelius Grand could dream of, a man named Marcus Reed watched the same leaked footage on a secure terminal and felt his stomach drop. "That's Carter," he said out loud to an empty office. "That's Ava." Marcus had served 2 tours beside her, had watched her pull a wounded teammate through gunfire on a mission that still didn't officially exist, had stood beside her at 3 funerals in 18 months, and watched something in her go quiet and stay that way. He hadn't spoken to her in 2 years, not since she'd left the service and asked gently but firmly to be left alone. He booked a flight that afternoon. He found her the next evening in her apartment, sitting on the edge of her bed, with the steel box open beside her, medals laid out on the sheet, like she was trying to remember who'd earned them. "You look terrible," Marcus said from the doorway, and Ava looked up like she'd known he was coming before he knocked. "Nice to see you too, Reed." "The footage is everywhere, Ava. Every serious organized crime outfit on 2 continents has seen it by now. Park's people have already pulled your file. Most of it's redacted, but not all of it. And that's the problem. He knows enough to be terrified of you, and terrified men do stupid, dangerous things." "I know. He's not going to let this go. Men like him can't. If word gets out that a waitress humiliated him and walked away clean, his whole empire looks weak. He has to make an example of you, or he loses everything." Ava closed the steel box slowly. "Then I suppose I have to make sure he doesn't get the chance." "This isn't a solo mission anymore." Marcus sat down across from her, his voice dropping into the register she remembered from 100 briefings in worse places than this. "I've got federal contacts already building a case against Park's organization, money laundering, at least 2 disappearances we can tie to his people, maybe more. If we do this right, we don't just protect you, we take the whole thing down." "There's a journalist," Ava said, "Ethan Brooks. He's been building a case of his own for months. If we combine what he has with what you have, then Park doesn't just lose a fight, he loses everything." Marcus almost smiled. "There's the soldier I remember." For the 2 weeks that followed, Park sent exactly what Marcus had predicted he would: increasingly dangerous, increasingly desperate men. A pair of contract killers who cornered Ava outside her apartment and left in an ambulance instead of her. A car that tried to run her off the road on her way to visit Grace, which ended with the driver in federal custody and a trunk full of evidence Park very much wished had stayed hidden. Each failed attempt didn't just fail to kill her, it fed directly into the case Marcus and Ethan were building, brick by brick, transaction by transaction, disappearance by disappearance. Ava never sought revenge. That was the part Park couldn't understand, the part that unraveled him faster than any direct assault could have. She wasn't trying to destroy him out of anger. She was trying to stop him because people were being hurt, and stopping people from being hurt was the only thing she'd ever really wanted to do. The whole reason she'd signed those papers a decade ago, the whole reason she still woke up before sunrise to train for a war she'd technically already left. "You could have run," Grace told her one night, when Ava finally told her sister the truth. All of it, Medals and scars and the photograph in the steel box and the 4 names she still said quietly to herself every year on a date she never explained. Grace had cried and then hugged her so hard it hurt and said, "You could have just disappeared and let someone else handle this." "I could have," Ava admitted, "but then who protects the next waitress he decides to break?" Grace didn't have an answer for that. Nobody ever did. Park's empire, meanwhile, was coming apart at the seams. 2 of his lieutenants flipped when federal agents offered them deals rather than prison. A shipping partner in Busan cut ties the moment his name appeared in leaked financial documents. Ethan Brooks's article, the one he'd nearly died gathering evidence for, finally ran, exposing Aurelius Holdings as a laundering front for one of the region's most dangerous crime syndicates, complete with financial records that were impossible to explain away. Park, cornered, desperate, and finally understanding exactly what kind of woman he'd spent a week trying to break, made the last mistake of his career. He took Grace. It happened outside the hospital where she was completing her final clinical rotation. 2 men in an unmarked car, quick and quiet, and gone before security even reviewed the footage. Park called Ava himself an hour later, his voice stripped of all its earlier confidence, replaced by something closer to panic, dressed up as control. "You have until midnight," he said. "Come to the old shipping warehouse on Pier 9, alone, or your sister disappears the way Ethan Brooks almost did. You'll let her go the second I'm there?" "You have my word." "Your word," Ava said quietly, "isn't worth what you think it is." She hung up, and for exactly 4 seconds, standing alone in her apartment, she allowed herself to feel afraid. Not for herself, never for herself, but for the one person in the world she'd built this whole quiet, careful life around protecting. Then she closed the steel box, put the fear away in the same locked room where she kept everything else, and called Marcus. He took Grace. "Where?" "Pier 9. He wants me alone." "You're not going alone." Marcus was already moving. She could hear it in his voice. Keys, a door, an engine. "I've got agents 20 minutes out. Ethan's got a police contact closer. Give us an hour." "I don't have an hour, Marcus. Neither does she." There was a pause on the line, the particular silence of a man who has fought beside someone long enough to know exactly what she's about to do and exactly why he can't stop her. "Then go in smart, Carter. Not fast, smart. We'll be right behind you." "I always go in smart. You went into a burning building in Kandahar with no backup and half a magazine, and I came out with 3 people I would have lost otherwise." Ava was already pulling on her jacket, already becoming, piece by piece, the version of herself that had been folded up under her bed for 3 years. Same plan tonight, just bigger building. Pier 9 at midnight was exactly the kind of place men like Park chose for exactly the kind of thing men like Park intended. Isolated, poorly lit, surrounded by water on 3 sides, a single road in that made ambush easy and escape hard. Ava walked in through the front, unarmed, hands visible because she'd already mapped 3 other ways out before Park's men even saw her coming. Grace was zip-tied to a chair in the center of the warehouse, terrified but unhurt, and the sight of her sister's face, pale, tear-streaked, trying so hard to be brave, was the only thing that came close to breaking through Ava's discipline that night. "Ava, I'm so sorry, I shouldn't have—" "Don't apologize," Ava said gently, not taking her eyes off Park, who stood 10 feet away, flanked by 6 armed men. "You didn't do anything wrong. I did. I forgot to teach you to watch the parking lot." "Touching," Park said, though his voice shook slightly on the word. "You came. Good. Let's finish this." "Let her go first." You're not exactly positioned to make demands." "I'm exactly positioned to make demands," Ava said, and something in her tone made even Park's most confident men shift their weight. "You've lost your shipping partner. 2 of your lieutenants are cooperating with federal prosecutors. Ethan's article is being read by half the country right now. And in about—" She glanced, unhurried, at a clock on the far wall. 18 minutes, federal agents are going to come through that door, whether I'm still standing or not. The only question left is how many of your men go down with you." Park's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough. "You're bluffing." "I've never bluffed in my life," Ava said. "Ask the 4 men who woke up in a hospital after 11 seconds in your ballroom." For one long suspended moment, nobody moved. Then Park, cornered and furious, and finally understanding that the woman in front of him had never once, not for a single second, actually been afraid of him, gave the order anyway. Kill her. It was, predictably, the last order anyone in that room fully obeyed. Ava moved the instant the first man's weight shifted, closing the distance before he could raise his weapon, using his own gun arm to put him into the man beside him. A third fired wide, the shot burying itself in a shipping container, and Ava was already inside his reach, disarming him with the same economical, brutal efficiency she'd shown in the ballroom. Except this time there was no audience gasping in shock, only Grace, watching her sister move like something out of a story she'd never been allowed to hear, tears streaming freely now, not from fear but from something closer to awe. 2 men went down together. A third ran for the door and collided directly with Marcus Reed, who had arrived 4 minutes early with 3 federal agents and no patience left for waiting. Federal agents, on the ground now. What remained of Park's men made the only sensible decision left to them. They surrendered. Park himself, back toward the water's edge, weapon shaking in his hand, staring at Ava across 10 feet of concrete floor, with an expression that had finally, completely, lost every trace of the confidence he'd walked into the Aurelius Grand with a month earlier. "You're just a waitress," he said, more to himself than to her, like he was still trying to make the math add up. "You're supposed to be nobody." "I was never nobody," Ava said quietly, stepping toward Grace to cut the zip ties, never taking her eyes off him. "You just decided I was, because it was easier than seeing what I actually was. That's the mistake men like you always make. You mistake silence for weakness. Every single time." Federal agents moved in behind Marcus, weapons raised, and Park Min-seok, feared boss of one of the region's most dangerous criminal networks, a man who had built an empire on the assumption that fear made him untouchable, dropped his weapon and put his hands in the air because there was, finally, nothing left for him to do. The trial took 4 months. Ethan's reporting, combined with the federal case Marcus had built, and the financial trail 2 flipped lieutenants provided, was more than enough to end Park Min-seok's empire permanently. 31 counts, no plea deal generous enough to touch the evidence stacked against him. Aurelius Holdings was seized. The hotel that had once terrified an entire city into silence reopened 8 months later under new ownership, its marble floors and gold trim unchanged, its atmosphere entirely different. Ava didn't go to the trial. She was subpoenaed, testified for exactly 40 minutes in a closed session, and left through a side door before a single reporter could get her name. When the Lee Chan-jusn story broke nationally, soldier waitress takes down crime syndicate, networks offered her interviews, book deals, a made-for-television movie. She declined every single one. "You could be famous," Daniel told her, back at the hotel for one last shift, watching her fold napkins with the same quiet precision she'd always had. "You could tell your story." "My story was never about being seen, Daniel. Ava smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it reached all the way to her eyes. It was about making sure other people got to keep living theirs. Grace graduated 3 weeks later, top of her class, and stood at the podium during her commencement speech and said, without naming names, without breaking any promises, "The bravest person I know spent years being underestimated by people who should have known better. She taught me that real strength doesn't need an audience." Ava sat in the fourth row and cried harder than she had in a decade, and didn't hide it from anyone. Ethan's article won an award he accepted with a still healing scar on his shoulder and a quiet, permanent gratitude toward the waitress who tried to warn him and hadn't given up on him even after he ignored her. Marcus returned to federal duty with a commendation and a standing invitation to Ava's door, which he used more often than either of them admitted out loud. And Ava went back to a quiet apartment, a locked steel box that finally sat open on a shelf instead of hidden under a bed, and a life she was, for the first time in a very long time, no longer trying to disappear inside of. She still woke before sunrise. She still trained, because some habits weren't burdens, they were simply who she was. But she took a new job, a small one, at a community centre, that trained young women who'd never been given the chance to learn what strength actually looked like. She never told most of them her real story. She didn't need to. They could see it in the way she moved, the way she watched a room, the way she never once mistook their silence for weakness. Because she, better than almost anyone alive, knew exactly what silence could be hiding. CTA, Call to Action. If this story moved you even a little, don't scroll away yet. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the one line that hit hardest, and subscribe so you never miss the next story like this one. It genuinely helps this channel grow, and it means more than you know. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. We'll see you in the next one.